welcome to our presentation on demand planning using Microsoft Business Central. For those that are on Business Central, these are functions that are going to be available to you out of the box. For those that are on Dynamics GP or Dynamics Nav, there are upgrade paths to move to Business Central. We love Business Central. A significant portion of Endeavor's 70+ consultants are all trained and busy implementing, supporting, training, optimizing Business Central and various components. As you can see on the right, manufacturing, finance, sales and distribution, marketing, a number of components are all included within Business Central, and obviously surrounded with the Microsoft 365, Office 365 for Outlook integration, Power BI reports, and all hosted in the cloud. Microsoft's continuing to make massive investments into the Dynamics 365 platform, both for the enterprise applications they have, as well as the mid-market being Business Central. So with that said, let's move on to the agenda page. So we're going to talk today about high-level demand planning, have some theory, how demand and supply need to be in balance. We'll look at forecast types, Business Central setups and fields that are available to you, help shape your mind around what is demand planning and how to use these tools. And at the end, we'll have some question and answers. Feel free to put some questions in the chat. I'll take a quick look at them. However, just to make sure that Yaz can focus his efforts on having a clear and concise demonstration, discussion, and presentation to each of you on the line. We may hold some of the questions to the end. And obviously, we're here to help. So Yaz, over to you.
Thanks, Scott. Hello, everyone. My name is Yaz Alamari. I'm a consultant with Endeavour Solutions, and I'm happy to walk you through some of the main concepts of the planning engine in Business Central today for the master production scheduling and material requirements planning, as well as the sales forecast or the production forecast. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Demand and supply. The planning in Business Central has two elements, the demand and supply. These two must be held in balance to ensure that the demand is met in timely and cost-efficient manner. Demand is the common term used for any kind of gross requirements, such as sales orders, service orders, assembly orders, production orders, outbound transfer orders, or blanket sales orders, or the sales or the production forecast. The supply refers to any kind of replenishment, and that comes from inventory, obviously, if it's on hand, or purchase orders, assembly orders, or production orders, or inbound transfer orders. MPS and MRP, those are main two terms that we use in Business Central. MPS stands for mass production scheduling, or as some people refer to it, it's independent demand, meaning it's a calculation of master production schedule based on the demand forecast, which could be for sales or production, and the actual production demand. The MPS calculation is mainly used for finished good items that have a forecast or sales order line. The MRP, or material requirements planning, or as some people refer to it as dependent demand, is the calculation of material requirements based on the demand forecast on the component level, or the actual demand for components. The planning system in Business Central can plan for both at the same time, MPS and MRP, or it can do one at a time. We control this through a global planning setup on the manufacturing setup page. We'll take a look at it in the system in a minute. Actual demand comes from sales orders and production orders. The forecasting functionality is mainly used to create anticipated demand. So the sales forecast is our sales team best guess at what will be selling in the future. We'll take a look at the demand forecast page in Business Central, where we can see on the type if it's a production forecast or if it's a sales forecast. That is usually controlled by a drop-down menu where you can see two options, either a sales item or a component. If it's a sale item, that means it's for sales orders or sales forecast. If it's a component, then that's the production forecast. The main reordering policy in Business Central are order, lot for lot, fixed reorder quantity, and maximum quantity. On this graph, you will probably have a better understanding visually of three of the reordering policies that we just mentioned. We'll start by order. Order is mainly used for top-level items and expensive components or sub-assemblies. It creates automatic reservations for supply. That's one of the downsides of using it if you're not willing to have reservations in place between supply and demand. And it also does not take into consideration any planning parameters either globally on the manufacturing setup page or locally on the item card. This basically means that there's always a one-to-one relationship between the order policy, between the supply and the demand if we're using an order policy, which makes sense when it comes to the definition of using it for expensive components or sub-assemblies. The most common planning reordering policy is lot for lot. It's mainly used for components that occur in multiple bills of materials in the manufacturing world. The system tends to bucket the supply for the demand, for multiple demands. So basically, you would have 3 production orders using the same component to build 3 different assemblies. And instead of sending 1 purchase order for each production order demand, you would send 1 purchase order for that component that buckets all the demand from all the production orders, the 3 production. Next, we have the fixed order quantity. This is mainly used for lowest level components in the manufacturing world. The fixed order quantity is typically used with a planning parameter on the item card called the reordering point. You cannot use a fixed order quantity policy without using the reordering point field. Last policy is the maximum quantity. It's mainly used for items with high carrying cost or if the company has storing limitations due to the size of these items. This reordering policy, maximum quantity, is usually used with a planning parameter on the item card called the reordering point. So as you can see, so the last 2 policies are tied to be used with a specific planning parameter on the item card. We'll take a look in the system and we'll locate these fields. And you will also see that once you switch between the reordering policies, some fields come to life and some fields are omitted and in gray and you can't work with them. That depends on the policy that you're choosing. We'll take a look at it in the system momentarily and you'll see that. Let's talk about the global planning setup fields. Those are on the manufacturing setup page. The first one is the dynamic low-level code. This is a very important field because it controls the calculations for bills of materials and their components. So basically, if you're building assemblies or if you're building sub-assemblies, for the planning engine to calculate the demand for the components on multiple levels, you will need to have the system calculate the low-level code. So it is in our best interest to make sure that this radio button or this field is activated on the manufacturing setup page. Other fields include the current demand forecast, where you basically indicate to the system that my main demand forecast, either production or sales, is this forecast. You might be wondering, well, why does that happen to be an option? It's because in Business Central, you have the flexibility and the ability to have multiple demand forecasts. We'll take a look and you'll see that we have multiple in place in a few minutes. Some of the other fields, there's the use forecast on locations. This means which location am I using the forecast on. So you can default the system to use a specific forecast in a specific location. Yeah. Another field is a default safety lead time. In Business Central, there is a priority concept where you could have a global setup and you could have a local setup. So this is a good example of a field that you would see on the manufacturing setup page, the global setup, or the local setup page, which is the item card. So you will see default safety lead time in both pages. However, the local setup on the item card for safety lead time takes priority over the global setup of default safety lead time. If you do not happen to have a safety lead time identified on the item card, then the system will take a look at the global setup and honor that as a default value. So the default safety lead time, the definition of it is an amount of time where we are trying to leave a buffer between the supply date and the actual shipping date or the actual usage date of this component in production or assembly. Combined MPS and MRP calculation, we talked about this briefly when we identified the MPS and MRP concepts. So Business Central on the manufacturing setup page allows you to choose either to calculate the master production schedule and the material requirements planning at the same time or separate them. Choice between either way is connected to usually the size of the company. For example, if I want if I have a big production plant or multiple plants, then it makes sense for the production manager or production scheduler to take care of the master production schedule planning only. And I would have my purchasing team or the purchasing manager look at the material requirement planning. That helps with segregation of duties and keeps each plan separate from the other. Another field is the components allocation. You can use this field to tell the system if you have multiple locations or multiple warehouse. Actually, I should probably side note, we use the term location in Business Central as a warehouse. So whenever I say location, it's basically a warehouse. So if you have multiple locations or multiple warehouses and you would like to have two of your plants, manufacturing plants, use one location or one warehouse, you would choose that location code on the global setup field in the manufacturing setup page. Okay, so for example, you have, as I said, two plants, but you don't have that big of a storage area attached to each plant. However, you have a warehouse that is big, and you can store all your components in. So you would dispatch a transfer order from that location or warehouse to your manufacturing plant A or B, depending on the demand. Okay, and how do you do that? You would assign that location code using this components at location field on the global setup page, the manufacturing setup. We'll take a look at it and we'll see. The other two fields are default dampener period and default dampener quantity. Those kind of have similar priority identification as the default safety lead time. So these three fields have a global setup field on the manufacturing setup page, or a local setup field on the item card. And the same thing, if you have a default dampener period, for example, on your item card identified as 1 month, okay, but on the global setup page, the manufacturing setup, you have a one week, then the system will always honor the 1 month because you identified that on the item card, and will only look at the 1 week identified in the manufacturing setup page if you do not have a value populated on the item card. The same thing goes for the dampener quantity period. To identify the dampener period, dampener quantity, those two fields are mainly used for the action messages that we see on the planning engine suggestion lines. We'll take a look in the system and we'll see them in a minute, but the definition of dampener in general, dampener period, dampener quantity, is, for example, a period. If I'm identified dampener period of 1 week, that means that I'm telling the system if there are minor changes in the demand size for a timeline. So for example, if the shipment date on a sales order moved by 3 days, and I have a default dampener period of 1 week, then I am asking the system to ignore the rescheduling of my supply that I have already done based on the first value or the previous shipping date. So the concept here is basically I'm asking the system to ignore minor changes on the supply side. If it's a timeline, then I'd use the default dampener period. If the changes are to a timeline, then this is the field, the dampener period. If the changes are identified in quantities, then I would use the default dampener quantity field. Okay. All right. So planning parameters on the item or stock keeping unit card. Those are what we define as the local setup planning setup fields. Those could be grouped. So as you can see on the screen, we have the ordering policy, reorder point, maximum inventory, overflow level, time bucket, lot accumulation period, rescheduling period, reorder quantity, safety lead time, safety stock quantity, assembly policy, manufacturing policy, dampener period, dampener quantity. The assembly policy and the manufacturing policy are not actually on the planning fast tab in the item card. However, they exist in the replenishment fast tab in the item card. We'll take a look at that in a second. But as I was saying, we can identify those based on groups. So for example, if I want to define when to reorder, I would use one of the 3 parameters in this group, the time bucket or the reordering point or the safety lead time. Okay. If I want to define how much to reorder, so quantity, I would use one of the fields of safety stock quantity, fixed reorder quantity, as long as it's attached to the reorder, I would use the reorder quantity field while I'm using the fixed reorder quantity, or I would use the maximum inventory field with the maximum quantity policy. To optimize when and how much to reorder, I would use the rescheduling period or the lot accumulation period with the lot for lot policy, or I would use the dampener period. Okay. If I want to determine whether the action message should reschedule an existing order or cancel it or create a new order, then I would use the rescheduling period. To accumulate multiple supply needs into one order, I would use the lot accumulation period. Okay. Let's see the next one. So also on the item card, we have what we call order modifiers. Those also exist on the planning fast tab within the item card. Those 3 are the maximum order quantity, minimum order quantity, and order multiple. Those are basically modifiers I would use. For example, if I have an order that is asking me, a sales order is asking me to supply 45 pieces of an item. However, I know that my vendor sells them in quantities of 50s only. So the box comes in 50. That's the smallest box that I can get. I can't buy them as pieces. So then I would assign a value of 50 to the minimum order quantity. Okay, so basically my sales order is asking me to sell 45 pieces, but my purchase order will default to 50 because that's the minimum order quantity that I can place with my vendor. And the same concept for maximum order quantity. Another example for its use for the maximum order quantity, the shipping process does not allow me to include 51 pieces. So I can only order 50. Then I would use maximum order quantity as well. So you can use one of these 2 fields based on the scenario, or order multiples. Okay. Business Central planning engine action messages. Those are the messages that we were talking about a few minutes ago when we talked about the dampener period and dampener quantity. So based on the setups that we have on these fields, either globally in the manufacturing setup or locally, we will get one of the 4 messages. It's either new, change quantity, reschedule, reschedule, and change quantity or cancel. So we only get the type new if there's no supply order in the system already created. So if this is a brand new supply suggestion for a demand that comes from a sales order, for example, then I will get a new. So the system would suggest creating a new purchase order for this demand from the sales order. If I have a sales order that was accounted for supply, and we created already a purchase order for that quantity, and then there was a change in quantity, for example, then the system is not going to create a new suggestion line with an action message of new for this change in quantity. The system will go back and take a look at the purchase order that we created, let's assume a week ago, for this specific sales order demand, and take a look at it and suggest a change in quantity instead of new. Okay. A reschedule would be the same example in the sales order. There's a little that we accounted for it a week ago, we planned for it, we created a purchase order. However, the customer came back and to us and said, I need it a week in advance from the initial shipment date. Then I will need to identify my vendor and ask them to ship the component that I'm selling a week in advance. So then the system would use an action message of type reschedule. If there was a change in the sales order, both on the quantity and the date, then the system would use a reschedule and change quantity. Cancel is an action message that would only see if the demand vanished. So for example, the customer just canceled the sales order. Okay, then there's no point of me buying these components because I can't sell them, or I'm not going to sell them in the near future. So the system will suggest the cancel action message. Those are just the definitions of what we just spoke about. Let's see. I think we're missing a few. No, I think this is it. All right, so let's jump into the system and take a look at Business Central. So first of all, we'll take a look at the manufacturing setup, the global setup page. So all right, so the manufacturing setup page, I hope you can see my screen. So you'll see some parameters here. We're not going to talk about all the fields that relate to manufacturing, but we will zoom in on the fields that we talked about initially for the global planning setup. So you can see the dynamic loadable code here, and that's basically how we tell the system that if you're planning for an assembly, please take into consideration the components as well. Okay. Now, however, if you're a current Business Central user and you haven't worked with this field before and you navigate to your manufacturing setup page and you see that it's turned off, then you would probably turn it on. However, I would recommend that you also run this job. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of issues with planning that a current Business Central user is having would probably disappear as soon as we run this job right here. Okay. Now, in my case, I already calculated the low-level code, so I don't need to do that. It's going to take some time. But basically, this kind of teaches the system all the sublayers of assemblies, sub-assemblies, and components that go into making the main assembly. Okay. And it's a very important field for the planning engine to operate properly. Next, we have, let's see, the current demand forecast. So as I said, there's multiple demand forecasts for sales or purchasing. As you can see, for 2023, I have 2, right? So I can tell the system, if I'm planning by default, then please take 2023-A in consideration and make it the default demand forecast, okay? If I don't want that, then I can take it out and I can leave the flexibility of choosing which forecast. So for example, in my case here, I just use the 2023 demand forecast, and I have the split between production forecast or sales forecast embedded within this code, okay? you could create a completely different demand forecast and give it a code production, or and the other one would be sales. Okay. In my case, I've been using the system for a while, so I just defaulted to using both, and I just created this one as an example that you could have multiple in place, so that we can show that you could use one of them, or you can leave it as blank. Okay. So in my case, just to make my life easier for the demo, I'm going to use 2023-A moving forward. Use forecast on locations. This is basically saying that the planning engine is going to use this demand forecast or production or sales forecast on all locations instead of just a blank warehouse. If you're not familiar with Business Central out of the box comes with only one warehouse or one location, which is the blank location. Okay? However, moving forward and using the system, you would probably want to create your own locations. So if you have 6 warehouses and you create 6 location codes, and each warehouse you could use the demand forecast on, or you can ignore the demand forecast on these locations. In manufacturing, which is most of the clients that I work with, they would want to use the forecast on these locations. Okay? The default wave save to lead time and the dampener percentage, default dampener percentage, or the default dampener period. You can see that those are the global fields that you will also be able to override in the item card. In my case, I just have one of them identified, which is the save to lead time. So I'm basically telling the system, always give me a buffer of 2 days from my arrival of supply of first orders or production orders or inbound transfer orders. Give me 2 days to handle them in my warehouse, or make sure that I can move them from one location to another for the shipping of the sales order. Okay. Combined MPS MRP calculation. This is the field where you can tell the system, I'm okay with having a one planner take care of the production schedule and the material requirement planning. If you work in an environment where there's a segregation of duties, then you would want to have this turned on. For the example, or for the sake of this demo, I would have them both turned on just for the sake of time, and we will see how we would get recommendations for example, a production order of main assembly and purchase orders for the sub-assemblies or the components that go into it. Okay. The components at location, this is the field where I was trying to tell you that it's defaulting that all components exist on one location. If you have multiple plants for manufacturing specifically, okay, or for assembly, then on these plants have enough storage attached to them, then you would want each plant to use its own inventory. So the fact that you see it as blank here, that means that I'm telling the system, if I need a production order at plant B, use the inventory at plant B. Don't go to plant C and ask for a transfer order for that inventory to plant B. Just use whatever you have in B. In the example where you have only one location, one warehouse, but multiple plants, limited stores to these plants, then you'd probably want to populate this field and choose the code for that warehouse that you put all your components at. Okay. All right. So these are the global setup fields for planning on the manufacturing setup page. Now let's take a look at the item card. Okay. So I think I have it right here. So we'll take a look at the items. All right. So I will show you the item that we're working with today. So we have H2. Okay, let's take a look at it. So this is an item of type inventory, has the code FH2. We store it on shelf number F7. This is an item that we manufacture. Okay, you can see on the replenishment system, it's a production order. The manufacturing policy is make to order. So basically, this is an item that I would only ask my planning department to plan for and create a production order for if we have demand for it from a sales order, for example. Okay, So I will not build this item and put on the shelf. Okay, this means usually that this item, if H2, is of high cost. Okay, or it takes a lot of space and I can't manufacture it and put it on the shelf and occupy much of my space that is probably limited in my warehouse. So that's why we use a make to order. If it's a high volume, low cost and fast moving product, then I'll probably use make to stock. This means that make to stock means that I don't really need a hard demand in the shape of a sales order in order for me to make this item and store it. I know I'm going to sell it. If it's not today, it's tomorrow, but I want to make sure that I have it ready because my clients usually need it now. Okay, so I will be I'll be making it and keep it on the shelf. It's going to move anyway. I know we're going to sell it. Then we'll use a make to stock. Another purpose of using make to stock, for example, if you have repetitive manufacturing, specifically in automotive, and you need to have these parts ready because they get shipped in high volume, then make to stock is the way to go. Okay. Another field is similar to it is the assembly policy. If you use assemblies, okay, if you do not use production orders, use assembly orders, then it's the same definition. Am I assembling to stock, putting it on the shelf, or am I assembling to the sales to order? Basically, I have a sales order, I need to assemble for it. Okay. Let's see. This is the main area where we actually work with the local planning parameters. So as you can see, the planning, we call this a fast tab. Okay, and this is where we have main planning parameters that we could use to help our planning system give us proper suggestions. So I'll show you the policies. Now, in the slideshow, you saw only 4. Okay. However, see this field, which is blank? That is an actual planning policy. So if I switch to it now, you'll see that most of the fields disappear. Yeah. This reordering policy blank means I don't want to plan at all. So that the system will not plan for this item at all. We will only plan for it manually if we get a sales order for it. Okay. This is a policy that we see with extremely high cost items. Okay, whereas usually multiple levels of approvals set up in the system using workflows. It's a different concept. We'll talk about it probably in a different webinar. But basically, it is a very expensive item, and we can't just create a production order for it or a purchase order for it just because we have a demand in the system. Someone needs to authorize it, and that's why it's a manual planning policy. Okay. The next one, let's take a look at order. Okay, order is the policy where we said there's a one-to-one relationship. So usually this is the same concept. It's an expensive item that we have that we manufacture or we assemble or we purchase and sell. However, there's no approvals in place. So if we have a sales order for it, then we would want to purchase it, we would want to manufacture it or assemble it. Okay. The caveat about this policy is there's always reservations. So despite that you can see that there's optional, never, or always on the reserve field, the system will always reserve this item from the demand from the supply to the demand. Okay. There's only a few fields available here. Okay. The rest of the fields, I don't know if you can see, but I can't click on them. I can't change that. Can't change any of these fields. So all of these fields are basically out of use. I can't use them. Okay. So this is a planning policy where it's one-to-one relationship and we'll create reservations. Okay. The reservations, one thing that we need to mention and be aware of, they're great to make your customers happy. So if a customer places an order for 20 pieces to be manufactured, you know for sure that these 20 pieces will have a hard link between my supply in the form of production, purchase, assembly, whatever. Okay, there's a hard link between that supply and my demand on the sales order. So I can't get into a situation where my production output, for example, of 20 pieces was sold to a different customer, the system will not allow the shipment of these 20 pieces to any other sales order other than the sales order that we created for the main customer. Okay. The downside of it is if you want to have flexibility with your demand and supply, then reservations take that away from you. Okay? So you cannot take these 20 pieces that you created for customer A in the first example and sell them to customer B, who's willing to pay you double the price of the item. Okay? You can't do that because there's a hard link between supply and demand. You will have to tell your customer B to wait until you're done manufacturing or you receive these items on a purchase order, then you can ship them to them. Okay. The next one is the fixed reorder quantity. And as you can see, the fixed reorder quantity is being used with the reorder quantity field. Okay. Some other fields come to life. You can see that a lot of accumulation period and rescheduling period, and for example, the maximum inventory can't be used. Okay. So those are the fields that are out of question, and those are the fields that we could probably use with the main one with the fixed reorder quantity is the reordering quantity. Now, if we go to maximum quantity, you will see that the reordering quantity is out of question. You will see that dampener period is out, the lot accumulation period, and the rescheduling period are all out of question. However, the maximum inventory field is the main field that I would use with the reordering policy maximum quantity. There's also other planning parameters that we could use to tweak the planning suggestions a little bit, like the time bucket or the reordering point or the safety lead time, safety quantity, for example. Okay. The last one, which is the most used planning policy, is the lot for lot. Okay. Most clients love this policy because it helps with bucketing all your demand, all your supply into one order. And that could be a production, a purchase, or a send. So for example, you have 3 sales orders. Each one is asking for a different quantity of the same item. Okay. The shipment dates are within 2 or 3 or maybe a week of each other. Okay. So it makes sense to, like specifically manufacturing, if you have machines that the setup on these machines, the tooling on these machines, the dialing of this tooling takes a long time. That time is worth money, right? So instead of creating 3 production orders and getting my machines set up 3 different times, my gauges dialed 3 different times, and lose that cost, okay, I would create 1 production order. I would do the setup once for the whole quantity of these 3 sales orders and just run it. That way, I'm saving money on my setup and production. So it gives me the opportunity to have better planning time for my plant, and I will be able to probably sell these items at a lower price than my competitors who would have to create 3 production orders and incur the cost of the 3 setups. Okay. On the purchasing side, it could be the same thing. So you have 3 sales orders for the same item that you purchased. However, instead of sending 3 different purchase orders to your vendor within a shipment period of say 1 week, and if this vendor, for example, exists overseas in China or India, instead of having to pay for the logistics of shipment of 3 different shipments coming from 3 different purchase orders, I would want the system to create 1 purchase order for the whole quantity, and I would pay for 1 shipment. Okay. As you can see with this policy, you're getting the lot accumulation period live. All these fields, because they relate to different planning policies that we saw earlier, they're not active. And I have the order modifiers active as well. Okay. Stock keeping units. This is a main concept that we use a lot in case of multiple warehouses, multiple locations. Okay. Not to confuse anyone, but as we at the beginning of this session, we did say that there's 3 there's two terms that we use for locations and warehouses. It's either locations or warehouses, but also we use stock keeping units. Okay, stock keeping units are not identified on a global setting. However, you can navigate to them by going from the item card itself. You go to related warehouse and take a look at stock keeping units. The reason why we're going to take a look at stock keeping units is to show you, for example, in the Toronto stock keeping unit, we have a field for the planning. Okay, so you have two levels of planning of the same item. You could have the planning parameters on the item itself, or you could have specific planning parameters for each warehouse that holds this item. Okay, so for example, in the Toronto warehouse, I have a lot for lot reordering policy, but I have the replenishment system set up to production order. That means if I get a sales order for FH2 item, then the system is going to take a look at, where am I selling this item? Oh, I need to sell it from the Toronto warehouse. Okay, then if I'm selling it from the Toronto warehouse and I have a plant attached to, manufacturer plant attached to the Toronto warehouse, and I can use the production order. So I will use, the system will suggest a production order to make FH2. However, if we get a sales order for the blue warehouse or the gold warehouse, okay, those are just generic names to our warehouses, then the system would take a look, actually here in the replenishment system, the system will take a look at the replenishment system on the stock keeping unit and will say, all right, this is a warehouse, the blue warehouse. This is a warehouse that I just shipped from, okay? So I can't manufacture there. That means that in order for me to ship from it, I need to transfer items from the Toronto warehouse to the blue warehouse. And that's why we have the transfer and the replenishment system within the blue warehouse, okay? So as you can see, the system is quite detailed about, and gives you a lot of flexibility when it comes to your warehouses. Just keep an eye on time. I know that we're running low here, so I'm just going to try to take you into the demand forecast real quick to take a look at that. Okay. All right. So as we talked about the demand forecast earlier, when we were looking at the default code on the global setup, you could have multiple forecasts. For sake of time, I'm just going to dive into the one that I created, and I'm going to zoom on the item that we were just looking at. So if I were to filter this field into FH2, okay, you'll see that I have a matrix here, and this matrix is, for now, shows me what am I expecting to sell. So the forecast type, if you recall, we talked about either sales forecast or production forecast. The fact that I have sale item, that means that this is a sales forecast for the item FH2, okay? The matrix is being showed in days because the view by field is set up to days. I could set it up to say, for example, for month. So if I do that, here I can see that for February, I have 6 pieces. If I want to see which day it is, I would just drill in. And here you can see that the date is for, look at the latest entry number. So we have 228, 224, 220, This is the latest one. So this is what the system is honoring. And I have 6 pieces. These 2 entries that you see here, this is just from previous uses for this demand forecast. Those were just tests that we were running, but basically this is the active one, okay? If we were to take a look at a quick use of this item in the planning engine, just for the sake of time, I will try to take a look at the item itself and see what I have in hand already. So I know for now that I'm expecting to sell 6 items in February. Yeah, I don't have a hard sale, a hard demand in the shape of a sales order. How do I know that? I will go to the item card and we'll take a look at the inventory fast tab. So you can see here on the quantity and sales order, we have 0. We have nothing for demand and service order or production order or any supply and purchase order. Okay. The only thing that I see is I have 5 units in my inventory. However, we have multiple locations, multiple warehouses. I don't know where this item is sitting. So if I want to do that, I'll just take a look at the item and I'll see that it's basically in Toronto. Another way to validate that, I will go to related, availability, and I will go to items by location. Then I'll get a matrix that shows me this item, FH2, and these are my warehouses that I have. So the unspecified is the blank location that we talked about earlier, but if I keep going, I will get to the Toronto warehouse and I'll see that I have 5 units, okay? So I have 5 units in the Toronto warehouse. I have a demand forecast, a sales forecast for 6 items in February. That means that I'm down by 1 piece. I cannot satisfy my expectations for sales with what I have in inventory already. So that means that I need to run the planning engine. And by that, I would navigate to the planning worksheet. So the planning worksheet is one of the 3 phases of the planning engine. The planning engine could be the planning worksheet, could also be the requisition worksheet, and you could probably see that there's a lot of similarities between the 2 pages. Yeah, requisition worksheet, look at that, look at the menu, look at the fields, and then go back here, it's almost identical. The last one is the plan, I think it's called the order planning, okay? On this is a global planning page. You can plan for all demand, or your production demand only, or your sales demand, service demand, or cloud demand, or something like that. This is an advanced planning feature in Business Central. We recommend that if you're new to the system, you would avoid using the order planning right off the bat because you might see a lot of difficulties in using it. This is for professional people who have been using the system for a long time, and they know exactly what they want to plan for. If you're still new, we recommend that if you're only planning for purchased items or MRP only, you could just use the requisition worksheet, okay? If you're planning for MRP and MPS, okay, then you can use the planning worksheet, all right? So these are just results that I had in my planning engine from previous tests that I was running in preparation for this demo. Let me just take that out. I'm going to delete all these suggestions, and then I'm going to run the planning engine to see what would it suggest to satisfy my sales forecast of 6 items when I have only 5 items on hand, okay? So you would do that by going to prepare and calculate regenerative planning. This pop-up window on the screen allows me to zoom in on either MPS or MRP. If you recall, on my manufacturing setup page, I had the radio button turned on. That means that I could run both MPS and MRP at the same time. However, I could, for example, ignore my MRP. I just want to plan for my MPS. Yeah, I could do that, okay? In my example, it doesn't really matter, so I'll just keep it on, and we'll also follow up on the assembly, on the components. So for example, I just want to zoom in on my FH2 item, yeah? So here you see the filter. I can zoom in on a specific item, or I can choose multiple items, or I can take it out completely and say, if it's blank, that means I'm asking the planning worksheet or the planning engine to plan for all the items in the system, all the demand in the system. For the sake of time, that usually takes a little bit of time for the system to calculate it, depending on the amount of sales orders that we have and the amount of the quantity of items that we're planning for. So just for the sake of time, I'm just going to zoom in on FH2, okay? And I will put my starting date from the 1st of January 2023 all the way until the end of March 2023, okay? I will ask the system to stop and show me any errors. Okay, so if there's an issue with the planning, I don't want to ignore it. I would like to be aware of it. Yeah. As you can see here, I'm planning for demand from a forecast. So it only makes sense for me to choose a forecast. If I leave this field blank, if I take this out, the system will not take a look at the forecast. We'll only take a look at the demand from the sales order or production orders and the orders. Yeah. In our example, we know that we don't have any sales orders in the system. There's no demand for this item other than what's coming from the sales forecast, which makes sense for me to use it here. Exclude forecast before. If you're not using the starting date or you're using a starting date of 1st of January, but you do not want the system to take a look at any demand from a demand forecast or a sales forecast, for example, from the 1st of February. However, you want the system to take a look at the demand that comes from sales orders in January. Then I will let the system know that I want you to move to the 1st of February for the forecast. So any demand in the forecast from January 1st to the 31st, don't look at it. Look at the demand forecast, the demand from the sales forecast from the 1st of February until the end of March. Yeah. If I'm okay with having the system look at both demand from the sales forecast or the sales orders or production orders all the way from January 1st to end of March, then I will not use this field. Okay. Respect planning parameters for exception warnings. You will see that the system sometimes creates exception warning messages. The system by default, any warning messages, the system does not by design look at any planning parameters on the item card. However, sometimes you do not just want to look at the exception message and accept it without having the system honor your planning parameters, specifically if you have planning parameters set up in place for buckets of time or buckets of quantities that would make it more cost efficient for you to finish the sale. Then I will want the system to respect the planning parameters, even though it's an exception, it's an exception warning. Okay, this field here, as I said, allows you to zoom in on a specific item or leave it blank. You can take a look at all the items or a group of items if you want. Here, I'm zooming in on the location Toronto because that's where my forecast is for, right? If you recall, when we looked at the sales forecast or the demand forecast, there was a code next to that 6 items. The location code was Toronto. So that means my sales forecast is specifically for 6 units out of my Toronto warehouse. Okay, we're running low on time, so let me just run this test really quick. And you see the results here is that I get 2. Okay, you might wonder, well, why are we getting 2, right? Well, that's because the first line is only 1. Yeah, where does that come from? Let's chase this one down. This is a production order the system suggests for FH2 for the location Toronto. And if I click on order tracking, this is the link that the system creates between your demand and supply. You might look at this page and see there's nothing to show in this view. However, the untracked quantity field has a value of 1. So if we click on that, you will see that this one suggestion for production order is coming from demand forecast. This makes complete sense because I have 5 units on hand. I have a demand forecast of 6 items on the beginning or the 1st of February. Then the system is saying, yeah, you have 5 on hand, you only need 1, so you only need to make 1, right? Okay, see this page and take a look at the other one. This line has a quantity of 10. So the system is asking me to make a production order for 10 pieces, on the 1st of March. Okay, where did this come from? Let's go to order tracking. Again, there's nothing to track here, but if you take a look here, you will see that there's a demand forecast for March. We were zooming in on February, so we only saw February, 6 units, but we have a demand forecast for 10 units. So the system created demand forecast for 10 units. Why did it create a demand forecast for 10 units, another demand forecast for 5 items, like the first case? Well, that's because the system looked at the dates and said, okay, 10 units for the 1st of March. That means that the 5 units that I would have in hand, plus the 1 unit that I would make on the 1st of February, will be sold. So I'll be down to 0 in the inventory. My demand forecast, sales forecast, is asking me to prepare 10, have them on hand for March 1st. Then the system is going to create a production order of 10. Okay, this was a really quick example. We're running low on time. We'll have 2 minutes left. There's a lot to the planning concept in Business Central, but this was just kind of give you an idea about the main concepts in the planning of the planning engine in Business Central. Okay, back to you, Scott.
There you go. So thanks so much, Yaz, For those that have additional questions, really support desk is our main entrance for clients to access consulting, training, mentorship, advisory services, future projects, you name it. Or next slide. While we have this here around advisory services, implementation, ongoing optimization support, Endeavour's in its 34th year, core values of integrity, trust, and accountability. Reach out to Trish, James, or Steve. Trish, our client success manager, James, client executive, and Vice President Steve Ewing, and all of us at Endeavour, your favorite consultants, our support desk, and obviously Trish, James, and Steve, and myself, Scott, and even Yaz. We're all here to help you and help you succeed and get the most out of your systems. Yaz is one of many members on our team, and we have the depth and knowledge to help Business Central and your Microsoft applications work for you. So with that said, everyone, have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye now.
Take care.